once the days start to lengthen in the early parts of the year, and particularly around about the end of March for most birds, middle to the end of March, with daylights lengthening and temperatures beginning to rise, this stimulates birds into action. And quite simply, what happens is their reproductive organs will suddenly grow, and huge hormonal changes take place in birds at that time of the year. During the winter months, they will quite simply have needed just to think in terms of survival. Where are they going to find enough food, and actually keeping going sometimes, as we know, in quite severe weather here, or it can be here in the UK. But with their reproductive organs growing suddenly, this is when everything happens. And you'll recall in the spring, birds are singing absolutely everywhere. This all happens quite suddenly. So what we're going to do is to look at this subject and move through the breeding cycle from the time on the left here, or before that time, when birds start to sing and hold territories. On the left here, we've got a bird called a penduline tit, building one of the most impressive of all birds' nests, certainly that we can see here in Europe. We'll be looking at those later. Once the nest is built, then the female will be egg laying. She needs huge amounts of energy to do that. And we're looking down in the middle of the picture, the slide here, at a blue tit's nest. They can lay quite large numbers of eggs. And the sort of thing we're going to look at tonight and try and answer the questions about why do some birds lay colourful eggs and others lay white eggs? Why do some lay small eggs and some large eggs? Why do some birds lay just one egg and others, as with blue tits, perhaps up to even 14 or 15 in a season? Well, of course, those eggs eventually hatch. The adults need to, in most cases, look after their young. There are a few examples of birds where the young are able to look after themselves from a very early stage. And my example of a young bird there is a barn owl. And I handled barn owl chicks and barn owls from around about 70 nest boxes each year, so I'm used to seeing these. And once barn owls hatch in a box, or naturally in a hole in a tree, or perhaps a cavity in a barn or a building, it actually takes them about 60 days before they fledge. It takes them a long time to grow. So we're moving the slides on now, and basically we're going to go from the beginning of the breeding season, thinking of birds singing. You may already have heard perhaps the odd missel thrush singing over the last few days, or perhaps a song thrush. It'll be a while before most birds start singing. It's not going to be until, certainly for this species, the middle of April, when sedge warblers arrive on our marshes around the country, and the males will be singing. It's only male birds that sing, incidentally, although all birds make sounds that we recognise and can be made by both sexes. What we call song is the prerogative of the males, and they sing for two reasons. One is to hold on to territories and defend their territories against other members of the same species, and this is a good way of doing this without fights occurring. But also they'll be singing to attract a mate into their territories. So the females will be hearing the song in a different way to other males would. For other males, it will be an aggressive sound, and for the females, it should sound really quite attractive. And hopefully, most males singing at their chosen territories will be attracting a female. So more on that a bit later on. Along with song, the males may be displaying. It really does depend from one species to another. And sometimes displays can be used by both sexes, both members of the same pair. We see this, for example, with a really famous bird here that most of you will have seen, great crested grebes, on waterways and watercourses everywhere, certainly around in the southern half of the UK, with their fantastic surface mutual displays. Displays will help to form and to build a pair bond between the two birds. That's going to be very important for them to keep them going through the breeding season to accomplish everything they need to do. So I've mentioned the word territories. and it's the males which will be mostly responsible for holding on to these. Territories will be areas of land of a certain type of habitat. We're often aware of this in woodlands more than anywhere else, where we'll go for a woodland walk. At whatever distance we walk, we're going to hear birds singing as we go around. And within an area of woodland, a species of bird, let's put in the first bird here, like a blackcap. The blackcaps that breed with us are summer visitors here, are going to be singing in areas of scrub and woodland, something like this. And they're going to be holding territories, possibly of a few acres. It's not going to be very many. So when we're hearing them singing, beautiful sounds for us, this is the birds actually aggressively marking out their territories only against other members of the same species, other blackcaps. So on the other side of the forest ride here, I put another blackcap singing back. The territorial boundary here, we would take a reasonable guess that that boundary runs along the woodland path here. So other birds can be singing at the same time. These two blackcaps singing against each other, shaking their fists and swearing. This seems to do the trick. They rarely come to blows. But whilst they're singing away at each other birds could also be singing. Birds like song thrushes, for instance, which I've popped in here. There might be chiffchaffs in the wood. There might be robins. There might be wrens. This can all go on because all our blackcaps are interested in is listening and responding to other blackcaps. So when we hear the dawn chorus, it can be a cacophony of the sounds of many birds. But the song thrushes are only interested in the song thrushes, as the blackbirds are only interested in the blackcaps. And chiffchaffs that I've just put in the bottom left-hand corner here, this chiffchaff has already established its territory. It's now starting to build a nest. So things are really moving along during the breeding season. So nests can come in many forms, as we're going to see. Many birds build nests. They build nests of many shapes, of many sizes. Some birds don't build nests at all. They might lay their eggs on the bare ground, which we're going to have a look at. Here we've got a nice picture of a pair of ospreys. It'll be the male here bringing in nest material. And sometimes these nests will be used by the same pair of birds, as we know, for a number of years, and they'll build up to an enormous pile of twigs, as we can see in the trees here. So I mentioned earlier on that eggs will come in a whole variety of shapes, sizes, and colours, with a huge variety of markings. So at one time I had access to an old established egg collection, and here are some photographs from that, showing a whole variety of different egg shapes and sizes here. The largest over here will be a great black-backed gull's egg. Here, the egg of a bird called the common guillemot, another seabird. We've got other gulls' eggs here, including this one here. That's probably a common gull. We've got something like kittiwake up on the top left here. These rather piriform eggs here. I'm going to talk about the shapes as we go through later on. This is the egg of a lapwing. Here we've got a sparrowhawk. Over on this side, I'm now pointing to tawny owl. This will be an eider egg, a big duck egg over here, and that's a nightjar over here. Much smaller eggs include house sparrow. That's probably dunnock here. This looks like a robin, chaffinch, and so on. So huge varieties for a whole number of reasons, and we're going to be able to, in a fairly short space of time, be able to cover a lot of those reasons. So what pops out of those eggs? Well, this can vary as well, depending upon the requirements of the bird. Here we've got a cygnet, a baby swan. When they hatch, they're pretty well developed. This enables them at least to move away from the vulnerable nest site, but they will depend on the parents to actually lead them to places, to find them places where they're going to find food. But young come in a whole number of forms. And over on the top left here, we're looking at a brood of young blue tits in a nest box, amongst huge amount of nest material there. They're bald and blind. They've got huge bright yellow gaits, which they'll use to try and attract the adults to feed them. But at the same stage of development, at the same age, on the bottom right, we've got a brood here of birds called Kentish plovers. The young would look very similar to the ring plovers that we find along our coastline here in the UK. They're the same age, but the ring plovers or the Kentish plovers have evolved to exist in a completely different environment where there's nowhere for them to put their eggs other than on the ground. The eggs will be well camouflaged, of course, but when the young hatch, they're in a vulnerable place. So when the eggs hatch with Kentish plovers, ring plovers, they need to be mobile. They need to be able to basically keep warm, so they're covered in down. They're totally mobile. And even at this very early stage, they will be starting to feed themselves. The adults will be there to brood them, to help to keep them warm, to keep them safe, but also to lead them to food. So completely different, the blue tits up above there will be feeding their young for something like 17, 18 days in the nest before they eventually become feathered and leave. So there are all stages of the development of young between these two extremes. And there are names, there are words that describe this. So the young blue tits are known to be altricial or nidicolous, which means that they are nest attached. They will be in the nest and need the protection of the nest for quite a long time before they eventually move away themselves. Or, as with the plover chicks here, they can be precocial and they're nidifugious or nest leaving. So that's a quick introduction to that. We're going to be looking at a few examples later on. So let's go through this fabulous season that we've got to look forward to with the spring coming up. So we're starting off actually with a couple of foreign birds here. Peafowl, or here we've got a peacock displaying, is an example of a bird, a male bird, displaying aggressively to keep off other males, but also to attract females. And that's actually a bird of the Indian forest, but of course introduced here into the UK. Birds like this, great frigate birds, are seabirds of the southern oceans with a huge wingspan of something like 8 or 9 feet. The males inflate their gular pouch, more or less like balloons, to attract the females and mark out their rather precarious nests in scrubby trees. So the male displaying like mad here, and the female has been attracted by his gular pouch. There we are. In fact, frigate birds are related to cormorants and also to pelicans. These are all birds that have gular pouches, which are used for a variety of reasons, except that this group of birds, magnificent frigate birds, greater frigate birds, there are three or four species around the southern oceans, have developed it further so that they can use them for display. And they're, of course, brightly coloured. So often we find that male birds are more brightly coloured than females. Certainly in the case here of the mandarin, quite super looking birds. They have two special feathers that grow on their backs here. Now it's their wings that are called sails, which they erect when they're displaying. So an example of a bird that is showing a difference between males and females. With bee-eaters, with European bee-eaters, a bird that we see on a fairly regular basis these days here in the UK. They're still not common, of course, but a lovely bird of Europe is a bird that is brightly coloured, and both males and females look very, very similar. So this is a bird that would need to display in certain ways to make sure that the males aren't over-influencing female birds when it comes to the selection of nest sites. But another example of a colourful bird. But then what about our robin, the European robin? This is one I photographed in front of my house here early one spring. He'd been displaying against another male. There was a bit of a dispute on the territorial boundary. And what they do is to show off and emphasize any colours or markings that they have. And this one has lifted its head up here. It's got its chest out. And in fact, it's swaying from side to side. That should be enough to keep another male back into its own territory. If it's not, this male is likely to fight the other one. But we see that very rarely. This display does work really well. But displays come in a whole variety of forms. So as with the great crested grebes we saw just now, males and females will display together. They'll display mutually. This is to help the pair bonding. And in this case, we're looking at a pair of marsh harriers. Interestingly, in this particular case, the male and female look alike here, but that's rather unusual. Above, we have the male that has brought in food close to the nest site, where the female has young or possibly eggs. And what we're seeing here is a wonderful thing to see with harriers, and that's this incredible food pass. The male has actually brought in a young mallard, chick. They take a whole variety of different types of food, which it's passing to the female. She's come off the nest, and that's going to help her. If she's in the process of egg laying, this extra food is, of course, a practical way of her building up more energy to lay a successful clutch of eggs. But it's also an important part of this mutual display. If you see this happening with birds, something is really going on. The pair bonding is being enforced, as we're seeing here actually this is a pair of herring gulls, male and female looking alike, and this type of display will often lead to mating, which takes place very, very, very quickly and quite simply. Both males and females have a fairly simple opening, which is called a cloaca, and that will come together, and the sperm is passed. And they'll be mating probably on a regular basis, although one of those matings usually is sufficient to fertilize the whole clutch of eggs that the female will quite naturally produce a certain number of eggs. So it's quite interesting that a number of birds will have what we call a breeding and a winter plumage. And we can see this in a whole range of species here in the UK. So we have on the right here, the winter plumage of black-headed gulls. Many of the black-headed gulls are still looking like this, although some of them are beginning to molt or change the feathers of their heads to come into their breeding plumage here. So that needs to happen ahead of the breeding season, and will happen at a time when the birds are becoming sexually able to reproduce themselves. So a lot of birds, as we've said, a lot of species will be sexually dimorphic. In other words, a very sharp, distinctive difference between males and females. This happens often with duck species, but not always. It happens with a number of passerines. It happens with raptors, a whole range of different birds, but not with all. However, this must help in distinguishing males and females, and help with this display, and help with pair bonding. Now, I don't know whether you've ever looked at goldfinches that visit your garden feeders, but you should be able to see, certainly by now, a difference between males and females. It is very slight, but sufficient, presumably, for them to recognize each other. The bird on the right is a male, and the bird on the left a female. You may already know this, but if you look at the extent of the facial mask of red here, on the male, above the eye here, the red extends beyond the eye, not a huge distance, but it extends beyond the line of the eye. On the female, that's not the case. So there we are, something to look at. If you enjoy seeing goldfinches coming to your feeders in the garden, try and, with your bins, you should be able to see this, distinguish between the two. So that is an example of sexual dimorphism, but not as striking as with the shovelers the ducks that we looked at just now. I mentioned that I'm in touch with barn owls throughout their breeding cycle. I spend a lot of time ringing them and monitoring quite a lot of nest sites. And male and female barn owls display quite a noticeable difference, but individual birds will vary with how much they show. And you'll notice the difference between these two birds is a paleness on the bird on the left, which is just an individual variant. But on the right, you will see a bird with speckling on its chest, and also that speckling runs underneath the top of the wings here. That indicates that's a female. Most female barn owls will have variable extents of speckling, as you can see there. The males do not, but that's obviously sufficient for them. So we're saying that male birds sing, that it's the female birds that, of course, lay the eggs, generally incubate the eggs, as with a lot of duck species and so on. The females are going to be well camouflaged to incubate eggs and not be seen by potential predators. In the UK, we have two examples of bird species. On the left, the dotterel, and on the right, the red-necked phalarope, of species where the sexes are almost not completely, obviously, because the females must lay the eggs, but are reversed. The bird sitting on the nest there, which you might expect would be a female dotterel, is in fact the male. The roles are reversed. With the red-necked phalarope, a similar thing happens, and the females are actually more brightly coloured, more distinctly marked than the males in both cases, both these species. So how should that happen? Why does this happen? The females lay a clutch of eggs, they leave it to the males completely to incubate the eggs and to raise the young. Well, these are both birds that breed in Britain, but they breed in the extreme north of the UK, and they're Arctic nesters. The Arctic breeding season is very short, so really, very sensibly, this gives the females an opportunity to produce several broods of young to be looked after by several males. So very different to other species, but it works extremely well. But those birds are at extremes of range. So getting back to birds singing and male singing, hopefully you may possibly have learned this for the first time tonight, that it's only male birds that sing. So when your wren is singing away in the garden, huge amount of song, great volume from a tiny bird. Birds that produce enormous song, particularly amongst the passerines, are often birds that aren't particularly brightly coloured or showy. And that's certainly the case with wrens. They're tiny anyway, but they produce a huge sound, important for them, obviously, to get their territories well marked out and to attract a female. But with these brown birds, they're given one other thing, apart from the ability to sing loudly and to us beautifully. They, in the spring, develop a brightly coloured gape, the inside of the mouth, yellow or orange or red, and that's shown at the same time. Same thing happens with the nightingale, a famous songbird, a bird that starts singing for us quite late fairly late in the season. There's summer visitors here, unlike wrens that will be here all the time, all throughout the year as residents. But another bird that comes as a summer visitor, probably one of our most widespread and numerous summer visitors, a bird called the whitethroat. So male whitethroat singing away here. You'll often see whitethroats singing on top of a bush or from stems and so on, out in the open, pretty good. They're birds that you can see quite well. But again, relatively dull in colour. So what do? They also have a very distinctive song flight. So the male will be singing away, and suddenly he'll launch himself from his perch up in the air, not very far, and he'll come gliding down, singing as he does so. Anything to make himself more obvious, and this has developed in some birds more than others. So a robin singing here in the spring is going to be a male. There are very few examples of where both male and female birds will sing, and sing perhaps the same or a very similar song. And this does happen with robins, but again, not during the breeding season. It means that their breeding cycle would not work. Female robins do sing, but they'll sing during the autumn and winter months. This enables them, alongside and against males during the autumn and winter, to hold their own territories, underlining the aggression of song. But this does not happen during the breeding season. So pretty well all of the passerines, certainly most of them, do have a noticeable song. Sometimes it might be tuneful, and others might not be. He's a wonderful bird to go and see, but not for us down here in the south and southeast of England. This is a bird called a dipper. It's a bird of the uplands of Britain, so we travel north and west to see these. And dippers have a lovely little song, but you might often not hear it because of the sound of the rushing, sometimes the gushing water of the rivers and streams that they find themselves breeding along. However, it's been discovered that the sound that they produced is of such a high pitch that the birds can hear each other singing really extremely well above the sounds that obliterate that song for the human ear. So we're saying that many birds sing. Certainly the hoopoe does. A bird that doesn't really breed here in the UK, but a widespread breeding species of parts of Europe. But this is one of a few birds that actually gets its name, even its scientific name, from its song. You may have been lucky enough to be across in Europe, particularly in southern Europe, and heard the hoopoe sing its poo 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 song. So that bird name is hoopoe. There we are, an onomatopoeic word for its English name, but its scientific name is also Upupa epops. Again, onomatopoeic. We talked about the whitethroat and its song flight. Some birds are very famous for their song flights. Skylarks, for instance, birds of open countryside, particularly birds of farmland. Pipits, some of the warblers, such as we just looked at with whitethroat and sedge warbler, is another. So here's a bird that quite simply is absolutely making sure that other male skylarks know exactly where this bird is and where they are themselves as far as their territories are concerned during the breeding season. So song flights can really help. Most of you will have seen snipe, long-billed wading birds that we see mostly in winter here in the south of Britain in our wetlands, but also birds that breed actually in the north and sometimes in the west, and a few places in the south here. The male snipe, when he's singing, will do so in flight. So he has a song flight, and I photographed one here. The sound that the snipe makes is not, however, a vocalization. The sound it makes is a mechanical one. Another name for the snipe is heatherbleat, because the sound that they produce sounds rather like sheep bleating, but the sound is produced by just two feathers on their tail. So this bird is in flight, displaying above its female, round and round and round in the air, and as it starts to descend and make a dive down towards the ground, it will open up its tail feathers, and particularly the two that you can see there, the two outer tail feathers, which they hold stiffly in the feather follicles. And what happens is that those two feathers vibrate to produce the song, in inverted commas, of the snipe. There are so many different ways that birds are able to do this. That's just one mechanical way of doing so, very different from the vocalizations that birds make. So we're going to go on next to look at birds and the nest sites they use, and eventually more of the eggs and the young that they produce during the second half. Birds will build nests. A lot of bird species will build nests, others will not build nests. Barn owls will look for natural cavities. They do not line their nests with any material. They don't bring grass or twigs into the nest site. But interestingly enough, they will reuse nest sites if they're good ones. This is a very regular site. That's a young barn owl peering out from a hole in a super old oak tree there. And that nest will be used year after year. Now, I've never managed to get down inside that hole. It's too deep, so we're not able to monitor those birds closely. However, at the bottom of the hole, the young birds, as the years go on, will have produced their pellets in the hole, and those pellets build up on the floor of the nest site and do actually produce a rather smelly lining. So some birds will nest in holes. We're going to look at those. Some birds will build quite intricate nests. We're going to have a look at those. But anyway, yes, so we're looking at nest sites, just started, and think in terms of birds like barn owls that nest in tree holes. Tawny owls nest in holes in trees, as does this species, the little owl. And we've got an adult bird here that's just come back to its nest site. And you can see just below its tail there, this bird's got a nest in an ash stump. Well, all sorts of sites similar to this will be used by little owls. So we're back to our barn owls again, and this is the sort of barn owl box that we're going to on a regular basis. This shape works extremely well. And of course, the great thing about nest boxes, as you may have found with tits in your garden, is that of course we can actually attract birds and help them out by giving them nest sites like this, and particularly in the countryside where we're seeing fewer trees, fewer old trees with potentially natural nest sites being lost. Then for barn owls, certainly birds like kestrels as well, we find that these boxes work really well. We know this happens well for members of the tit family. At Sandwich Bay Bird Observatory, I'm not sure, I think we've got something like 100 nest boxes up around our various reserves. This is box number E54 in the elms, a small piece of woodland. And these are good sites, obviously, for birds like blue tits and great tits to use, safe places, and of course, taking the place of natural holes in trees. Occasionally, birds like nuthatches, a great woodland bird for us and really quite a successful bird, moving its range north in the country these days, is a bird, particularly of oak woods. They'll use nest boxes, as you can see down on the right, a natural site on the left-hand side, and you can actually see where the bird has used mud, which they're famous for doing. And it's literally used mud, which it's mixed with its own saliva, which has hardened the mud, and it's actually made the natural site smaller. It's coming out of its tiny hole that it's left behind it, like a cork out of a bottle there. A number of birds will actually use mud in building nests or around nest sites. Even the one on the right at the nest box has used some mud around the edge of the box. It's used to doing this in more natural conditions. So birds like blackbirds will line their nests with mud. Sometimes birds like of course, always birds like house martins, swallows will build their nests from pellets of mud that they collect from the ground. And incidentally, house martins do not only nest on buildings. I live on the coast here, alongside where the chalk cliffs start to build up on their way down through to Dover to the south of us here. And we do have a natural site of quite a good number of house martin nests actually on our chalk cliffs, which you can see there, built underneath an overhang rather than underneath the eaves of a house somewhere or a building somewhere. They do need to come down to the ground to build their nests. They're summer visitors, and they get cracking with their nest building very quickly soon after they arrive. The bird taking off there on the left indicates that they don't just use mud. They'll pick up rootlets, perhaps sometimes pieces of fine grass, which helps to stabilize the nest and hold it together. Their close relatives, the sand martins, however, nest very differently. They excavate holes in sometimes sandbanks, but they're often boulder clay cliff banks. This one up in North Kent, and they'll excavate quite deep tunnels where they'll raise their young. So very different. The bird that excavates its own site where it's able to. Woodpeckers, of course, do the same. They'll choose sites where there's generally rotting timber or soft timber in trees. Lesser spotted woodpecker is the example here. So they're creating sites, perhaps unavailable as natural sites, where they can keep their young relatively safe from predators. The tits are great hole nesters. So blue tits and great tits do this. Two species here. On the right is a bird called a marsh tit. On the left, a bird called a willow tit. Unfortunately, in southern Britain, we see few, if any, of the willow tits now. They're very similar looking birds. I'm not going to go into the difference between them, although your books will explain this. But a major difference between these two species is that the marsh tit on the right here will nest in natural holes in trees. Rather the same as blue tits will and great tits, they go for natural holes. Willow tits excavate their own hole, rather like woodpeckers, and they'll go usually into very soft timber. So a difference there. Puffins, we know, nest in burrows underground, on offshore islands, on sea cliffs around our rugged coastline. Sometimes they'll excavate their own burrows, mostly they do, but sometimes they'll take over rabbit burrows as well. That's a good example there. But completely different to those hole nesters are the birds that build their nests. Out of a whole range of materials, we've already thought in terms of, or looked at mud builders. Well, here's a female blackbird collecting grass. She'll be using twigs to develop her cup-shaped nest hidden away deep in some vegetation somewhere. And here we're looking down into the nests of three British thrush species. On the left, the nest cup of a blackbird. On the top there, that's a missel thrush, and song thrush is the bird that produces the lovely bright blue eggs with black spots. And you can actually see that these nests, we're looking down in the cups of the nests. You can also see that with missel thrush and blackbird, although they will have used mud to make a nice firm lining, they've actually lined their nest with grass. Song thrushes don't do this. For some reason or other, they don't use grass, but they also collect and use what we might describe as wood pulp. They'll collect tiny pieces of rotten timber, very soft timber, which they'll mix with their saliva, and they'll make the nest lining from that. So even amongst the thrushes, there are differences. This is the chiffchaff that we looked at in the early slide, nest building. Chiffchaffs build their nests very close to the ground, perhaps only a foot or so off the ground. Their close relative willow warblers build a nest with a roof, actually with a roof over the top, on the ground. A lot of woodland birds nest on the ground, and well, when do chiffchaffs arrive here in the UK to start breeding? They'll arrive in March. They'll be nest building through March and perhaps into April. At that time of the year, very early on, robins will be nesting at the same time. Where is all the cover for them? In our deciduous trees that will have no leaves on. All the cover is on the ground. From the dead plant material, things like bracken and bramble and so on, that have been left over from the year before, that's where the cover is for these early nesters. So a lot of birds will nest on the ground. Some birds build complicated nests, as we discussed with the penduline tit earlier on. Great name for a little bird. Unfortunately, they don't breed in the UK. However, they do breed not too far away across in Europe. They'll build a nest built by the male, attached to the hanging twigs and branches with leaves on the end on willow trees and often hanging over water. The nest on the right there is only half completed, and the male bird intricately weaves a nest of a whole variety of material from animal hair and using sheep's wool or plant down to cover it. And there's a photograph on the bottom left of the complete nest with an elongated entrance, which generally is pretty successful in keeping out predators. House sparrows build a very complicated nest as well. Very few birds actually weave nests together. Blackbirds will sit on a pile of material, as will birds like chaffinches, and they revolve round in this material until it naturally links together. But house sparrows will actually weave a nest. They'll actually weave the pieces of material in and out. It might be an untidy structure. They'll often build in hawthorn hedges, hedgerows generally, but also in the roof spaces of buildings. Well, the house sparrow, our house sparrow, is very closely related to the weavers, sometimes called weaver birds of other parts of the world, particularly Asia and certainly Africa. This is an African red-headed weaver that is just beginning to start to build its nest here in a coral tree, and those nests can also be quite intricate. We won't go into the details of those. Nests will be built in a whole variety of places. The birds will use the countryside and the habitat that they have available to them. So here, built in amongst the stems of reeds, of common reeds, is a reed warbler's nest, a deep nest which is woven. It's woven around the stems of the reeds there, holding it up above the water level. So might seem to be a dangerous place to nest above the water, but it works extremely well. The doves and pigeons always build quite simple nests. Some of the dove species, like stock doves, nest in holes in trees, but turtle dove here, wood pigeon, collared dove, just build a very simple platform of twigs to support their eggs and young. I mentioned birds nesting on the ground. We've got 3 examples of woodland birds that do just that here. Nightingale on the top left, always on the ground. Willow warbler, a nest with a roof over the top, entrance on the side, on the ground. Robin here on the ground. Not always, they nest in all sorts of odd places, robins, but very often on the ground. In amongst the leaf litter, in amongst the newly emerging vegetation on the ground, giving them obviously sufficient cover for their nests. Of the birds of prey, none of the falcons will build a nest. All of the falcons will nest either on the nest of other species, or they'll nest in cavities. On the right, we've got hobby. On the left is a red-footed falcon. This is an interesting combination. Red-footed falcons don't breed in Britain, but hobbies do. And their numbers are actually reasonably high these days. So, as a falcon, it doesn't build a nest, but you'll see hobbies with their young, feeding their young, on a nest. Hobbies will take over the nest of the year of carrion crows. Carrion crows breed early. They finish nesting. By the time the hobbies arrive, which is quite late on in the spring, they will take over a crow's nest. Same with kestrel. They'll perhaps nest on a crow's nest, perhaps a magpie's nest or something like this. So crow's nests are commonly used by hobbies. Their close relatives, the red-footed falcons, when you go across the continent, are birds that nest in colonies. They're colonial. So where do they nest? They use the nests of rooks. Rooks are colonial birds themselves, and the red-footed falcons will take over at those nesting sites. Safe place to nest or to build a nest is on the water itself. That's what grebes do. Sometimes floating, like this one, great crested grebe, with an absolutely wet floating nest. That bird's incubating eggs, and I can tell you that those eggs hatched successfully. This is the environment, this is the habitat of great crested grebes. Fairly safe away from predators there. Many birds will quite simply lay their eggs on the bare ground. Waders will do this. The nightjar, a superbly camouflaged bird, will lay its 2 eggs on the bare ground, a bird of open woodland or heathland. The female here has a clutch of 2 eggs. It's during the daytime. She's asleep on those eggs. You can see her eyes closed there. This is a bird that comes to life at dusk. But look at the markings on the wings there and the mantle, look just like bits of dead bracken, and that's just superb camouflage. Lit at night here, as I have done to get this photograph, the bird stands out from that background a bit. We've got an egg on the left of the bird there, which is just hatched. And I don't know whether you can pick out the tiny chick that's hatched here. They can be pretty vulnerable at this stage on the ground, but their camouflage obviously helps to hide them away from potential predators. So waders of all kinds, or birds of many kinds, nest on the bare ground, and waders do this particularly. And stone curlews are waders, except they're not wetland waders. They nest in rather dry, heathy places. And here we have the female raising off her eggs, well camouflaged on the ground here in a field in Norfolk. The male coming in to take his turn to change over as quickly as possible to keep those eggs incubated. A little turn on the sandy beach at Sandwich Bay. Back in the 1970s here, these no longer breed, unfortunately, on our beach at Sandwich Bay. There's too much pressure from people, dog walking, sailors landing, and so on. But these are rare birds, and it's not surprising. However, there we are, 2 eggs in a tiny, shallow scrape in amongst the sand. And then our seabirds nest very simply as well. Okay, puffins nest in burrows, as do Manx shearwaters, but others, like gannets, these are on Bass Rock, will quite simply lay their eggs on the bare rock and breed very, very close together, and sometimes in very, very large numbers, as they are doing on the rocks of Bass Rock here. This was a population that suddenly was half demolished with bird flu, but their numbers are building back up again. It is actually quite a successful bird building its numbers up once again. So birds can be laid in different shapes. Now, thinking of the waders that we've looked at nesting on the ground, this is a lapwing's egg here, piriform in shape, so that a lapwing will lay 4 eggs and they can sit them together with the narrow pointed ends into the middle of the nest, taking up as little room as possible. Guillemots nesting on rock ledges on sea cliffs, again a piriform egg. The idea is, and it obviously works, that if that egg is knocked on the ledge, if it was round, it would roll off at the ledge. However, if it's knocked, it might roll round in a tight circle. That's a theory, but it obviously works because they mostly don't lose their eggs on the ledges, but they spend a lot of time sitting on them. Really intricate markings. The nests of the eggs of individual birds will be different to those of others. In fact, even if you look at a clutch of lapwing eggs, each one will be different. The markings you're seeing on those eggs are actually placed on the shell, and the shell will harden as the egg is being laid, and blood vessels will burst alongside pigments, with pigments involved as well, to quite simply lay these markings on the eggs. So they'll vary from egg to egg. Sometimes there are no markings. Birds that nest in holes in trees, like owls, this is a tawny owl's egg here, will be white. Why produce pigments? Why go through the energy of producing pigments if you don't need them? In a tree hole, it's dark. You can lay your white egg. It's going to help you to find them. They're also going to be rather rounded, so that you can easily move them around and incubate them. The colours of passerine eggs will vary enormously, from the bright blue here of a dunnock, perhaps a redstart, the rather well-marked eggs of house sparrow here and chaffinch. This will be a moorhen here. They're very, very variable. We can't go through all of these. We don't have enough time. But eggs will vary in size, obviously, dependent upon the size of the bird. So you'd expect this alongside each other there. Great black-backed gull's egg, blue tit's egg. That's fine. Difference in bird size, you're going to expect that. Difference in size between two owl species here, tawny owl and little owl. But here we have two very different birds, birds of the same body size. Snipe on the left, blackbird on the right. Blackbird lays smaller eggs. When its young hatch, having been incubated for round about 12, 13, 14 days, they hatch pretty quickly. But when they hatch, the young, as we saw before, will be nidicolous, nest attached. They're now going to grow up in the safety of a nest. The young snipe that hatch from a larger egg will be much more developed, able to walk, they're not blind, they'll have a certain feather covering, will actually hatch from that egg in the open, on the bare ground, where quite simply they're able to move around and stay with the parents. So big differences there in size as well. Eggs are incubated more by females than males, but sometimes both will take over. We've got an example here of what all female birds have, sometimes males, and that's a brood patch. This is a bare patch of skin on their undersides, which develop as the breeding season commences. They put that bare skin on top of the eggs, a whole clutch of eggs, and they're able to transmit their body heat quite simply straight onto the eggs there. And what happens as the season begins, blood vessels start to swell to produce even more body heat. Just a few birds will actually incubate eggs with their feet. Gannets will do this with their great big webbed feet, webbing between four toes here. Boobies, birds called boobies further south in the world do the same. There are blood vessels actually that you can sometimes see on these structures, not on this particular bird here, that swell during the breeding season, so that again they can use their feet to transfer body heat. Quite interesting. The nests and the eggs here of a variety of birds. We've got our blackbird up here. This is just to show you variety. This is the nest of a Chetty's warbler, a deep cup of lovely brick red eggs. Linnet up on the right here. Reed bunting. Here's a nest on the ground, typically here of reed bunting, well, camouflaged little eggs. And this is the nest of a short-toed lark, one of the common lark species of Europe. And that one again is on the ground. So these cup-shaped nests provide really quite a bit of shelter. But again, in contrast, we've got a nest site here of ringed plover on the ground, rather like the little tern that we looked at just now. Well camouflaged eggs, narrow end pointing into the center of the nest site. Same again here, beautiful nest of a bird called a golden plover, all well camouflaged eggs there. This is on the wet, marshy areas of moorland here. The eggs showing disrupted markings. What those markings will naturally do is to break up the general rounded shape of the eggs. And you'll notice that one bird has laid those, but each of those eggs is marked differently. The beautiful eggs of kestrels here. Interestingly, the raptors, birds like kestrels, sparrowhawks, peregrines, will lay rather beautifully marked eggs, which will have something to do with why they were collected by collectors in the old days. I'm not condoning that, of course, but these will always be, or often be, in places where the eggs will be hidden or well covered. In this particular case, we can take a pretty good guess as to which was the last of the eggs laid here, and that's the one at the back with few markings on. Probably the female had run out of pigments at the time that she laid her last egg. This all comes from the amount of energy required by birds. But again, if you're a hole nesting bird, why need colour? Why use markings? Just lay white eggs. These are the rather rounded eggs, again here, of barn owl. Very occasionally, we'll find mandarins with their nests in the nest boxes of barn owls. They naturally nest in holes in trees, usually with water nearby. So not such a dramatic looking female there, but a nest with lots of down. She's plucked the feathers from her undersides there to help to incubate the eggs, and she'll cover those up each time she leaves the nest. So then on to the young again. We've talked about nidifugus and nidicolous young, those that are in the nest for longer, need the shelter of a nest, whereas with the waders, they're nidifugus young, nest leaving. They're rather well developed in contrast. But we've got our blue tits again on the left. The one on the right here is a young starling. They have these enormously developed, bright coloured gaits. Obviously, the adult birds don't fall in love with their young, but what they are compelled to do somehow or another is to bring food back and place that into the wide open gates when they open them up, of the colourful gates of the youngsters. And look at the colour in the gates of these young bearded tits. They're actually marked inside the gate. And over the years, as I photograph birds, I've realised, and there are books on this anyway, that most bird species will produce young that have slightly differently coloured or marked gaits to other species. It might just ensure that these adult birds that are concerned about gathering food for their young will come back to the right nest to place it in the gates of those youngsters. Very different again here, just bright yellow, rather plain gaits here on a bird called a grasshopper warbler, with its nest in the grass of a wetland somewhere here. The rather reddish coloured gaits of young greenfinches. With a large number of birds, particularly the warblers, let's say, they will bring individual insects back to feed their young, whereas birds like finches will gather a lot more food, hold it in their crop, and they don't actually partially digest the food, but it will be masticated, perhaps in the gizzard, and brought up again and held in the crop. And what they'll do is to regurgitate this, and you can see it's quite sticky here, as a green porridge for the young. And this is one of the reasons that greenfinches and other finches have done rather poorly recently with all sorts of diseases they've had, and these diseases are associated with the digestive system, and particularly with the crop. Now, all that in comparison to nidifugus young. That's a young avocet. You could take a pretty good guess at that. That bird is probably only, it's a reasonable size there, so that's probably 5 or 6 days old, but it's independent. Look at its legs, well developed, long legs. It's feeding itself. The adults will be nearby to see off predators and make sure the youngster is safe. And again, back to our pair of golden plovers. Here's a young golden plover. They have long legs, they're active. When the adults call in alarm, if there are predators around, the young will quite simply stop and sit down and blend into this background of moorland, mosses, and a whole range of different vegetation there. So the ducks, geese, and swans will have young that are nidifugus. They'll keep them with them. They will actually find their own food very early on. And as these water birds grow, this is an interesting picture here of 2 young little grebes. These are independent of the parents at this stage, and they've learned that the mallards are very active nearby, and the mallard there is upending, pulling up pieces of vegetation, of water plants to feed on, but this is bringing up fish and invertebrates for them to feed on. So the young are going to look very different. I told you earlier on about barn owls taking 60 days from hatching to fledging. They're all of 4 different sizes here. The females will incubate from the first egg that's laid. That will often hatch several days before the next, and so on. But they'll generally stay in the nest together until the last one goes. Some young little owls here, just emerging from the nest hole we looked at earlier on. To have a look around, these are young marsh harriers on a nest in the reeds, looking very aggressive. They'll really have a go at approaching predators. Young guillemots here on a sea cliff. This is about the stage where the young guillemots will actually jump from those ledges, sometimes a few hundred feet above the sea, just one per pair. The male will then leave with them, take them out to sea, and to get them going. So we've come to the end of the talk here. Another very different, well, it's the same sort of subject, but we could have talked about here brood parasites. Well, we know, for instance, that our cuckoo is a brood parasite. They lay their eggs into the nests of other birds, and that then means that the adults of that other bird species, in this case a dunnock, will feed the young of the cuckoo. So a very different way of going about this. There's a young cuckoo just about to fledge. There are 150 cuckoo species worldwide. Not all of them are nest parasites, but it is a different way, and we've seen so many different ways of birds breeding, but a different way to produce your young. So a very quick look at the breeding season of birds, and thanks very much for listening to me.